So I recently finished reading Kierkegaard's Either Or. Um, for those of you who don't know, Kierkegaard is an existentialist philosopher. He was active sometime around the late 1800s. He's a Danish philosopher, and he's a philosopher that I've always sort of gravitated toward. So whenever I was really young in high school, I got kind of, everyone has their Nietzsche phase, right? Everyone has their phase of like, nothing matters, dude. Oh, like, dude, meaning and like God and stuff, it's all just like an illusion. I never got so far to the point where I was an atheist. I always believed in God. I've always been Christian. That's a whole nother topic. Deal with it in a different video. But so I've always considered myself Christian, and for that very reason, Nietzsche always sort of appealed to me, but Kierkegaard was always a little bit closer to my heart, just because it seemed like his philosophical endeavor was one where he really is trying to grapple with Christianity, and not so much grapple against Christianity, but grapple with the state of philosophy as it sort of relates to and opposes things like faith or things like the Christian God or just the Christian way of life, right? And so I've always had a fondness for Kierkegaard. Anytime I've ever tried to read him, that fondness has always been a lot more in theory than actual practice. Like, I've sort of found that I always enjoy his writing in the abstract. I enjoy the quick little quotes and stuff like that. But then whenever I actually dig down and try to read Kierkegaard, it's always a lot more fun in theory, right? The first experience that I had really trying to dig into his work was I had picked up a copy of The Essential Kierkegaard by Hong and Hong, and that book has just a bunch of little snippets from a lot of his work. And something that I thought was really fascinating about Kierkegaard is he writes from all of these different perspectives under these different pseudonyms. And the reason being is because, if you speak as like a religious author, you're pretty much only going to get to reach a religious audience. That was not what Kierkegaard's mission was. Kierkegaard wanted to talk to people who were not religious, but he wanted to sort of, in a sense, he wanted to assume their worldview and then kind of play it out to its conclusion. And he would not, in all of his writings, he wouldn't be an explicitly religious thinker. And Either Or is like the perfect encapsulation of that. But so something that I kind of picked up while I was reading The Essential Kierkegaard was that, number one, a lot of his stuff goes over my head. Like, a lot of it is just difficult to grasp. It's very he's very dense at parts, very poetic in some other parts. He reminds me a lot of Nietzsche. Obviously, they were contemporaries, but they come to totally different conclusions on a lot of things. And I think that a lot of people gravitate toward Nietzsche now because he is the philosopher of our day. Like, Nietzsche wrote with the 21st century in mind, and he was sort of a prophet of the 21st century. He had a lot of predictions right about where things were going to go on a geopolitical scale and this sort of a thing. But his project was he wanted to reconstruct a sense of meaning, like from the ground up, because he was like, God is dead, quote unquote. I hate that stupid phrase. Like, it's so cringe. Like, and I get what he's saying. And the truth is, a lot of people will argue about whether or not there's any like applause or sense of like victory in this proclamation of Nietzsche's that God's dead. Jordan Peterson thinks, oh no, he's not applauding it, he's lamenting it, he thinks it's a horrible thing. And then like actual Nietzsche scholars are like, no, he's definitely saying that it's like he's like kind of triumphant in this. But Nietzsche is a deep enough philosopher that you're not, the deeper a philosopher is, the more that they can say two things at once and mean two things at once. And getting back to Kierkegaard, that's something that he does incredibly well. Like, Kierkegaard, he's able to occupy two completely opposite perspectives to such a degree that he's able to write a book like Either Or, right? Where he's, on the one hand, on the either, he's completely occupying and expounding on the worldview of the aesthetic man. I'll get into that here in a second. And then on the other hand, he's able to occupy the completely opposite worldview and talk from the perspective of the ethical man. And so, anyways, that's just kind of an intro to what we're going to be talking about with this book today. But so I read The Essential Kierkegaard, and it just gets little snippets here and there. But there was a quote from, I think, Kierkegaard himself, where he pretty much said, like, my books are not meant to be read in little snippets. Like, you're not gonna get the full thrust of what I'm trying to say unless you read the whole thing. And so this edition, I picked it up in Austin, half price. I was there looking for some theology books, and I've been kind of on a theology kick recently. But then I saw some Kierkegaard, and I remembered the days of my youth. Whenever I would skim Kierkegaard quotes, and I'd be like, dude, that's so deep, bro. So I had my Kierkegaard phase, where most people have their Nietzsche phase. Anyways, I was like, let's let it not be a phase. Hey, mom and dad, this is not a phase. I'm a Kierkegaard head for life, and I really appreciate Kierkegaard, and I really like Kierkegaard. So because of this, I feel like I need to really dig into his writing, and I need to really not just pick up the essential Kierkegaard, where it's just little snippets, but I actually need to read one of his works in their entirety. Now, obviously, the ironic thing is that I do think that this Penguin edition actually is like a, not a paraphrase, but what do they call that? Where they chop big parts out of the book. That's fine. Okay, that's fine. I know Kierkegaard would have lamented this. He would have scolded me for this, but I didn't want to, like the book is already 600 pages. It took me like quite a while to get through this. And they're dense. They're dense pages. It's not just, I take that back. There are some parts that are, like I said, very, very poetic. Reminds me a lot of Nietzsche. But then there are the parts where he does get sort of really analytical, and he's talking about like the universal and the particular, and it's all this like kind of, he was responding to Hegel. So a lot of the terminology that he's using is responding to this great excitement that Hegel had stirred up in his day. And Kierkegaard's project is essentially like a rejection of this whole Hegelian idea of like the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because a lot of the thinkers of the day were kind of looking at Christianity and looking at the Enlightenment and all of these things and saying that, the world spirit is coming to this sort of collective realization, and we're reaching like an end of history, right? And Kierkegaard's like, no. And you kind of see this with like a Jordan Peterson nowadays. I made a previous video where I talked about Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God. I think I was not tough enough on Peterson in the way that most people are tough on Peterson, which is that, Peterson does this thing where he kind of over psychologizes the biblical stories, and he doesn't take them in the same sense that like the tradition at large has taken these stories. And Kierkegaard was kind of responding to, people are gonna clip this and call me like cringe or whatever, but Hegel was the Jordan Peterson of that day. I'm kidding. That's that's honestly really not a very good comparison, but it does kind of speak to this sort of watering down of the real sort of mystical element of these stories. Like these stories are not merely metaphors. At least Kierkegaard doesn't seem to regard them as that. At the same time, Lutheranism was like blowing up in his country. The Protestant Reformation was well underway, and Kierkegaard, it seems like he is kind of coming to grips with some of the problems of the Protestant Reformation, at least from what I can tell. It seems like he was kind of picking up early on that this abstraction that comes out of the presuppositions of the Protestant Reformation are having a negative effect on how people are actually living out the Christian ethic. And so, but even beyond that, the book, Either Or, in short, if I was to describe it in pretty much one sentence, it's that the either is the aesthetic man and the or is the ethical man. Both of these are worldviews. Both of these are ways of living and ways of looking at the world, and they're totally inescapable. It's a completely inescapable binary that we all exist within. It's a criterionless choice. You have no choice but to make this choice. And postponing the choice, or trying to rationalize some sort of synthesis between the either or, is itself just choosing the either. It's choosing the aesthetic. It's choosing. It's wanting to have your cake and eat it too. But anyways, so essentially, like in either or, he's laying out a profound analysis of the psychological differences between these two worldviews. Kierkegaard is a psychologist, first and foremost. I did not understand this whenever I was younger. Whenever I was younger, I just would take these little single quotes and I'd be like, wow, that's deep. And then there would be parts that were just totally inaccessible to me. And I'd be like, I have no idea what he's saying. I can't even begin to grasp what he's trying to say here. Maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. But I got a little older. I read some Nietzsche, and then so I'll just keep reading because I wrote it out here a lot more. I wrote it out here a lot more nice than I'm putting it right now. So essentially, the ascetic man is somebody whose worldview is primarily aimed at the maximization of pleasure, right? And then the ethical man is somebody whose life is primarily concerned with a task, or you could almost say that his life is totally conceived of as a task, right? It's not so much about pleasure. And I've always been very fond of Kierkegaard, like I said earlier. I think he's very enigmatic, definitely somebody who seemed very troubled, but nonetheless brilliant. And, like I said, Nietzsche is kind of like everyone's so pro Nietzsche nowadays. And I honestly think it's because they can't understand Kierkegaard. Like, not that they can't understand Kierkegaard, but that they won't. Like, they refuse to understand Kierkegaard. I think that if people were sufficiently, I don't know, it's a chicken or the egg thing. It's like, do they not accept Kierkegaard because they don't want to, or they can't understand Kierkegaard because they don't want to? Did I just say the same thing twice? I might have just said the same thing twice. Maybe that made no sense, but yeah. So essentially, so I think Kierkegaard has not received the same accolades today among moderns as has Nietzsche, and I think it is due to the depravity of our age. And so there's a report that a friend of Nietzsche's had recommended him Kierkegaard and had said, "Hey, you got to check this guy out. He's a brilliant psychologist. Like, he's probably the greatest psychologist of our day." And it's funny because Nietzsche too he's one of these existentialist philosophers. He's in the exact same sort of zeitgeist as Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, and they're all very psychological thinkers because they're all existentialist philosophers. They all belong to that, I don't want to say school, but that sort of like era, or that zeitgeist. And so Nietzsche never really got around to reading Kierkegaard, at least according to what we know. And so I think there's a copy of Kierkegaard's work in Nietzsche's like reading, like book pile. I don't think he ever got to Kierkegaard though. And we'll talk more about that later and what I think the implications of that were. But so essentially, like, the despondency that we have in modernity, I think it existed in prototype within Nietzsche, right? Like, the things we're struggling with today was the same things that Nietzsche was kind of grappling with and trying to figure out, and ultimately came to certain conclusions about whenever he was alive and when he was active. And the religious revivalism of our day, likewise, I think was present in Kierkegaard. I think our day has kind of seen the Protestant Reformation play itself out, and or is seeing itself still being played out. And I think Kierkegaard was able to detect some of the currents of where these things were going to be headed eventually. And so, like I said, the religious revivalism of our day had its prototype in Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, in fact, from what I've heard, he saw himself as a modern Martin Luther who was hoping to reform the Lutheran Church. I don't think he so much meant it to be an actual like material reformation that was going on. I think it was like a reformation in like heart, Reformation in mind, because his project is all about inwardness. It's not about reforming the church or anything like that. In fact, Kierkegaard was very critical of just like the church as like an actual institution. Um, but so essentially like what is contained within Nietzsche, which is a sort of like ecstatic sentiment, it's also contained within Kierkegaard. Like Kierkegaard is also able to hit on and is aware of the exact same things that Nietzsche is aware of, but he's able to describe it in his Aesthetic Man, which is the first half of the book, the Ether. He's able to describe it and kind of play it out as well. Like he's able to sort of he has Nietzsche contained within him, but then also has something else that I don't think Nietzsche ever was able to really reach. And so, the Ether of this book, I honestly think about it as Nietzsche contained within Kierkegaard. But then I don't think Nietzsche could possibly have conceived of the Or. I don't think Nietzsche could have conceived of the ethical man in the way that Kierkegaard conceived it, because in Nietzsche thinks that the ethical that's being put forth, he kind of has like a resentment towards it, and he calls it slave morality, right? He thinks that the priestly class and the religious people, that they're essentially embittered at their position in life, and so they want to like get back at the world by putting their hope in some future world that can only be really conceived of in the realm of faith. And so, but that's just a total straw man. Sorry, Nietzsche, you strawmanned the hell out of Kierkegaard, and it's pretty cringe. It's pretty cringe of you to do that. But the Chad Kierkegaard completely mogs the the incel Nietzsche. I hate when people say Nietzsche. He totally mogs him in Either Or. Anyways, because you think, who was it that said that like the person, like the true philosopher, can hold two opposing ideas in tension and can kind of entertain both. And I think it's a mark of a great thinker to be able to do that, right? And also, Kierkegaard had a huge inspiration in Socrates. And we know, like reading Plato's dialogues, Socrates was like devil's advocate par excellence. Like he could argue his way into a position, out of a position, and it was never super clear what he stood for, but that's because he was using irony to make a point. And Kierkegaard does the exact same thing, and Kierkegaard, that's why he's writing under all of these pseudonyms, and he's even critiquing his own writing with these other pseudonyms. And so I think Nietzsche ultimately, he stopped short, devoid of any sort of heroic faith, because faith is a heroic virtue. It is, you could say, the heroic virtue. And so because of this, he sort of spirals down into madness. But Kierkegaard, you could say, spirals up into madness, which is that he sort of relinquishes any claim to reason. Like he's not trying to do what Aquinas did, where he's trying to like rationalize his way to God. He's not trying to do that at all. He sort of forsakes that, and even going so far as to literally fracture his psyche into all of these different identities, right, that are conversing with one another and critiquing one another and have all these opposing viewpoints. I think he's spiraling up into madness, right? And so it's a madness that is relinquishing its claim on reason, or relinquishing reason in pursuit of truth. Like it sees reason as a great tool, but ultimately it falls short of actually like reaching that final realization of truth. And so he critiques himself from all these different angles. And so in the first half of the book, we have the Ether, and the Aesthetic Man is just railing on and on. He's giving all of his accounts of what he thinks about life. And there's this beautiful encapsulation of how the Aesthetic Man sees life. And I think if I can find it quickly, I will avoid paraphrasing it because to me it's one of the most beautiful passages of of all of Kierkegaard. Well, it starts out like this. He says, "What is a poet? An unhappy man who hides deep anguish in his heart, but whose lips are so formed that when the sigh and cry pass through them, it sounds like lovely music." And so, this aesthetic man here in this book, whose name we don't know. We don't know the name of this man. It's funny because he despairs, but he kind of he's clinging to that despair, and he's totally unwilling to relinquish it, and he kind of romanticizes his own anguish, right? And let's see. There's some more. He says one should be an enigma not just to others but to oneself too. And so the aesthetic man essentially is not interested with coming to any sort of real knowledge of self, any like sense of repentance or anything like that. He's trying to remain willfully obtuse to himself and also to others. And there's a beautiful line later on where the ethical man, his name is Judge Wilhelm in this book, he kind of is speaking to the aesthetic man, and he says, what if no one bothers to figure out your riddle? Essentially you're spending all of this time and energy trying to be this enigma, trying to be this riddle to other people, right? And never really showing your true colors. What if no one ever really bothers to try and peel back the layers? Like, what will it have all been for then? He also asks him, do you laugh when you're alone? Because the big thing with the aesthetic man is he always wants to be the one who laughs, right? And so let's see. This was the one quote that I was looking for. This is my favorite. This is my favorite Kierkegaard. I'll just jump straight into it. So he says, something wonderful happened to me. I was transported into the seventh heaven. All the gods sat there in assembly. By special grace, I was accorded the favor of a wish. Will you, said Mercury, have youth, or beauty, or power, or a long life, or the prettiest girl, or any of the other many splendors we have in our chest of knickknacks? So choose, but just one thing. For a moment, I was at a loss. Then I addressed myself to the gods as follows. Esteemed contemporaries, I choose one thing. Always to have the laughter on my side. Not a single word did one god offer in answer. On the contrary, they all began to laugh. From this I concluded that my prayer was fulfilled, and that the gods knew how to express themselves with taste. For it would hardly have been fitting, gravely, to answer, it has been granted to you. Now, aside from the fact that I could literally create a whole video just on that alone, I just think it's so, that's such an amazing little, just the whole thing. We're going to talk later about why he is appealing to gods and also why he considers them his contemporaries. But you see here, the aesthetic man is essentially one who always wants to have the last laugh. But in doing so, he ends up being the laughingstock of what is called the universal. He ends up being the laughingstock of everyone and everything. And he sees the irony in this, but he still is not able to give up this sort of childish wish. And so the aesthetic man is essentially a very tragic figure, but he doesn't recognize this tragedy. And it's because he wants to have the last laugh. He thinks that he's going to get away with life being some sort of a comedy. And because of that, he is a very tragic and pitiful figure. Even his happiness is a sort of despair. It's a sort of despondency. And I mean, is that not a perfect encapsulation of Nietzsche? And I'm just now realizing as I'm saying this, there's literally a Nietzsche quote where he says, the great man is one who has climbed the highest peaks and ascended to the lowest depths and has laughed at it all. That's nuts. Okay, so you see what I'm saying? Kierkegaard contains Nietzsche within him, and more. Okay, so please, can we just, I don't want to hear about Nietzsche anymore. If you're still like a Nietzsche fanboy, get out of my face. Like, you are a scrub. Kierkegaard mogs you. Okay. Kierkegaard mogs you. And you need to sit at the feet. You need to sit at the feet of Kierkegaard, and you need to learn. Okay. You need to get you some learning. You need to get schooled up, because you look like a scrub. You look like a dork. And you're getting mogged on. You're getting mogged on by the Danish philosopher. Another thing too that's odd is they both died quite young. They both died, I think, in their 40s, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. So I don't know what that means, but there's so many ways in which I think these two parallel. Anyways, I'm getting kind of off topic, but essentially, so like I said, to choose so Kierkegaard, he sort of talks about this choice between the either or, and it seems that the Judge Wilhelm is a lot more conscious of this choice than is the aesthetic man. And that's because the aesthetic man has sort of made his living an effort to forget this choice and an effort to forsake this choice, because he thinks in doing that he's going to transcend it. He's going to be able to sort of laugh off the idea that there is this choice to be made between the aesthetic life and the ethical life. And but you'll see that this produces a loss of awareness, and a loss of consciousness, and a loss of self, and a loss of choice ultimately. And so it seems to be that his total dedication to aesthetics falls short of any real beauty, right? And so it falls short of any real beauty, any real freedom, any real choice between the two. And so to choose the aesthetic life over the ethical life is to forsake both, to lose one soul and still not gain the world. And, or anything in it for that matter. And so to choose the ethical, on the other hand, is to aim at a union with God. And not only that, it's to forsake one's claim to anything in particular, including beauty or pleasure, and to simultaneously gain them back. Kierkegaard not only compels one to believe, but also to believe without holding anything back. Believe without presuming one knows what is right for oneself, and trusting only in God to provide illumination on that matter. And because in the modern day, you always hear people say, well, if you really need a God to tell you what's moral, then you're some kind of a monster. Yeah, dude, no, you're literally stupid. You don't know anything about philosophy. There's no grounding for morality or ethical action, or for any sort of action, without some sort of appeal to the transcendent. The fact that you don't understand that means you don't even have an awareness of your own philosophical tradition. Like, you haven't even taken philosophy 101. You're a scrub even within your own tradition. Like, you don't even know your own tradition. And if you're not willing to admit this, you're sort of a coward within that tradition. You're a coward of cowards, I will say. And so let's see, what else was there? Dang, there was one other point. I didn't write it down, but something hit me while I was going through that. But essentially, so it's this sort of relinquishing of feeling like, well, I know what's right for me, and I'm going to try to justify my actions. I'm going to try to justify, myself before God, before reality. I'm going to try to justify myself before myself. And this results in a total loss of yourself, and a total loss of any sort of freedom, any sort of real choice in anything, and it essentially results in being laughed at by the gods that you considered yourself a contemporary of. And so Kierkegaard is essentially, in this book, in Either Or, he's embarking on a science of self, and I call it that because this science of self, it's incredibly circular, and it's incredibly paradoxical, like all at the same time. And yet, I think that once you start getting into these sorts of questions, it's impossible for things not to be sort of circular and paradoxical. But I think it's fruitful nonetheless. I think his inquiry into this science of self is a very fruitful endeavor, at least for Kierkegaard. And so first we're taken through the labyrinthian psyche of the aesthetic man. And so one thing you have to understand is that all men naturally are in this mode of being. They are pursuing pleasure. They see the point of life as to enjoy life, and they'll stop at nothing essentially to guarantee that for themselves. And their choice is no real choice, and even what choice they have will be taken from them. And our day, I think, is especially depraved because our aesthetics are so dreadfully unaesthetic. And that's because, the days of Hellenism are very far from us, right? So even our aesthetic people are not very cultivated. They're not very thoughtful. They're not very artistic. They're kind of just like masturbating and playing video games all day. Like it's a very sad state of things that we're in. And so Kierkegaard describes a popular sentiment, which I shall refer to here as postponement, which is an incredibly cowardly and ill-conceived tactic of the least clever among the aesthetic peoples, which is, postponement is essentially a sort of agnosticism in the face of this question of either or, meaning you pretend like this choice between either or doesn't even exist, or that it's not of any real concern, or that, you try to act like you can postpone the choice. So one thinks that by pretending that life view and lifestyle are of no real consequence, or that Christian universalism is true, this idea that everyone makes it to heaven, eventually everyone's going to make it to heaven, or this idea that the ethical is only possible after some deliberation and a real sort of considering of all options. This is in essence what postponement, this in essence is what makes up postponement. And so to postpone the decision and await some form of criteria or some authority to tell you what the decision ought to be for you, is essentially to have already made your choice, right? You have made your choice, and that is you have chosen the aesthetic. You've chosen to try to have your cake and eat it too. And so essentially to try to postpone the choice is to neglect to even have a choice. You've chosen the aesthetic by default. Like you always just default to the aesthetic if you don't make the choice for the ethical. And so the decision's made for you. And there can be no Hegelian synthesis in this. There's no sense in which you can sort of have a little bit of taste of the ethical life and a little bit of a taste of pleasure. Michael Segru, he puts this perfectly in his lecture on either or. To try to concoct a Hegelian synthesis between the either or is to be the aesthetic man par excellence, because you want the ethical life, you want to have the benefits of virtue and all of this stuff, but also you want to be able to dabble in your own little creature comforts and stuff like that. Yeah, you're an aesthetic man. You're an aesthetic man. You're just a very, very sophisticated one. And so the aesthetic in the final analysis is found to be a particularly cowardly and unheroic pagan polytheism. And what you say, wait, what about the atheist? Like, I'm an atheist materialist. I don't believe in this like polytheism stuff. Yeah, dude, you're a polytheist. You're a pagan polytheist. Sorry, like you need to get learnt up, and you need to realize that you're even more like the things that you hate about religious people. That's you. Like that's literally you. If you're this like person who thinks you're just a rational atheist materialist, dude, you're a pagan polytheist. You believe in multiple gods. You believe in more gods than me. And I'm a Christian. So what does that say? Think about it for a second. But so, yeah, I mean, essentially, even if you claim atheism or something like that, you're a pagan polytheist. And what does this mean? So, in what sense is that true? You have left vacant the throne of the soul, which is to only be occupied by God. And as a result, many demons, passions, and ideas vie for the throne of the soul. And they take turns, like musical chairs, just all, one day lust is the primary thing that occupies your mind. And then the next moment, it's pride. Or the next moment, it's your stomach. The next moment, like it from moment to moment. You're just sort of jumping between what is like the highest thing for you, and the only real thing that you're following is your own whims, which are ultimately not even your own whims. It's the whims of demons and the powers that tempt you. And so whatever flits before your mind's eye essentially is like whatever you take to in the moment. There's no continuity. There's only immediacy, and also change. But what the cultivated aristocrats protest of the aesthetic man of taste who has subordinated his base passions for the sake of the highest pleasures, right? The intellectual life and beauty. So what about the people who actually seem to have well-ordered psyches? Their life is put together. They're not, out shooting up. They're not like banging hookers. They're like, doing science and philosophy, and they're very cultivated, cultured people, and they even appear very moral to people, right? What about these people? Are they too merely aesthetic people, or can they be considered ethical? Or like is that still a lamentable position? Are they still in despair? And ultimately, yeah, they are, because so essentially here the argument is that this person has come to order his soul rightly, right? That he's put a good order to his soul. And so he's fair to friends and cruel to enemies. He's found good favor among the people and has kept for himself the spoils of war. Kierkegaard would say that this person is all the worse, right? Or I don't know if Kierkegaard would say that. I would say that I would say that for sure after having read this book, because this person is all the worse, much like the man of Matthew 12. And it's because in Matthew 12, there's this parable that's told of a man who cleanses his home of a demon. The home is the soul, right? He cleanses this demon from his home, and then he sets the home in order, right? He cleans the home. The home has been put totally in order. Christ says that the latter state of this man is worse than when we first found him. And it's because having cast out one demon and then set order to your soul, right? Having cleaned your room, you've just made it more hospitable for the demon and his friends who are coming back later. And I've even put in here that you've even sort of poured them a cup of tea or coffee. Like, you've made it extremely hospitable to them. And like, what do I mean by this? Essentially, it's like, how much damage can you do if you're just like a junkie who's strung out on the street? Like how much damage really can you do to yourself and others? Only so much, right? But what if you're someone who is an aesthetic man, and you're so well put together. You're like a billionaire. You're like a millionaire, whatever. And you have lots of people under you who you're the master of, right? You're a CEO or something like that. You're somebody who's well put together, and yet you're still an aesthetic man who will essentially sacrifice it all for whatever whim sort of takes control of you in that moment. Are you not somebody who's capable of far more destruction and of destroying yourself in a far more catastrophic way than the junkie on the street? Because the junkie on the street is pretty much only hurting himself. But you now with more power, right, and pride and position and status, like, you can do so much more damage like that, right? And it's all a result of you having cast out this lesser demon of lust or whatever. You're casting out this lesser demon and taking control of your life, only to make your home, your dwelling place, that more hospitable to the demons and the passions, right? And so, no, this person is actually worse off. And in fact, the person being written to, so the aesthetic man in this book, the either, he is this man. Like, he is a poet. He's an artist. He is a man of taste, right? And because of this, he has concocted a much more damaging philosophy for himself and for others. He does so much more damage as a result. There's a part in this first half of the book called The Seducer's Diary, where he just details his process for seducing this young woman. and getting her to fall in love with him, only for him to have her break off the engagement. And the idea here is he essentially just wants to flex that he's capable of this. He wants the satisfaction. He doesn't want the love to sour in marriage. He just wants to have her for that moment. Know he could have had her, and then he wants to have it be over and done with, so that their love, their passion, their romance will exist always in this sort of platonic ideal of itself. I mean, is this not tragic? Like, is it not tragic to live that way? And it sort of displays like a lack of trust in oneself, because you're essentially saying you don't think you're capable of keeping the love alive over the course of a lifetime. And you blame the institution of marriage. Like, you say that, oh, marriage is what sours true love between these people. But essentially the aesthetic life view, even whenever it's highly refined, is tragic. It's incredibly tragic. And so there can be no question as to how well the house can be cleaned if the throne remains open to whomever would come and seat himself within it. This is the either or. And so, as I'm reading this book, all I can think is, if Nietzsche would have reached the bottom of his list of reading, like if Nietzsche would have finally got to Kierkegaard, if he would have finished all of his other books and finally got to the bottom of his pile, would he been able to have saved himself? And in so doing, saved many others. Thanks for tuning in. That's Either Or. See you next time.